In this lesson, we'll learn how we can render out an animated sequence from Maya. So the name of the scene file that I'm going to be working with is called Lesson 15 Start. And you can see in this scene we have this animation of a horse running. So what if we actually wanted to look at the animated, or rather the rendered result of this horse? Well, we can come in and just really choose any frame. So let's say maybe something like frame 7 or 8. And if we wanted to just see an individual still render of this, we can use just this Render Current Frame button, which we learned how to use in one of our previous lessons. So we just simply click on that, and then just give this a moment to render out. And once this is finished, we can actually see the rendered result of this current frame. So the rendered result actually lets us now see the calculated result of any lights or shadows that we may have in our scene. Now, using this method of just using this little clapboard icon is really just a way of previewing a single frame render inside of Maya. Now, what if I wanted to go through this rendering process on my entire animation? Well, to do that, we're going to use a slightly different method. We're actually going to utilize what's called a batch render in Maya. Now, before we go through the batch rendering process, there are a few really important things that we need to set up in our scene. So let's go ahead and jump over into the render settings. Now these are going to be this little clapboard icon with these two little dots next to it. So let's go ahead and click on that, and that'll pull open Maya's render settings. Now let's go ahead and jump over into this Common tab. And if we take a look right underneath this, we have this path that's been laid out. Now this is actually telling us that whenever we go through this batch rendering process, this is telling us where my images will actually wind up. So it's going to put them inside of our current Maya project directory, inside the images folder. Now inside of that images folder, I'm going to wind up with a file that's called Lesson 15 Start. Now the reason that it's called Lesson 15 Start is that by default, Maya will actually name your images based on whatever your Maya scene file is named. So because my Maya scene file is called Lesson 15 Start, that will also be the name of my images that get rendered out. Now we can change this if we want to. So if we go down to the file name prefix, we can manually determine some kind of a file name for this. So let's maybe call this something like render sequence. There we are. See if I can actually spell this properly. There we go. So render sequence, and once we define that, we can now see that this file name has been changed. Now whenever we render this out, we can see that the file name will have this .iff prefix, so we can change that down here if we want to. So if we want, we could pull this down and switch this from a Maya IFF to render out in maybe a TIFF sequence. We could render out as a JPEG, Targa, Windows bitmap. Now you may be wanting to actually render this out as some kind of a movie file, so something like an AVI or QuickTime. Now you'll notice that Maya actually doesn't give us that option. So what we'll need to do is instead render out what's called an image sequence. So we choose something like Targa. So you can see now it will render out with a TGA extension. Targa I find is a really good format to use. It's got a good mix between nice high quality and relatively manageable file size. And what is going to happen is that with this set to a Targa sequence, we're actually going to wind up with a new image for every single frame. So for this 12 frame animation, we're actually going to wind up with 12 separate images. And here in just a few minutes we'll learn what we can actually do with that. Now at the moment you can see that it's set to just render out a single image or a single file. That's because right now this file extension prefix is set to just simply name.extension for a single frame. Now if we wanted to render out an animated sequence, which we do in this case, we need to pull this down and choose something like name number extension. And now you can see it will render out this file .1.tga, so for frame 1, and that will render all the way through to frame 10. So I'm going to wind up with 10 images. Now in my case that's not really going to work because my sequence is actually 12 frames long. So if we need this to render in a sequence that is going to be longer or shorter, we can scroll down and go to the frame range. So by default this is going to set to end at frame 10, which like I said in my case that's really not going to work. I want this to render actually to frame 12. And again, if we take a look up here, we can see now that this is going to render from frame 1 through to frame 12. Alright, very good. And below this we do have a few additional options, so we can choose things like the actual size of our render that's going to be output. I'll go ahead and leave mine set to the default of 640 by 480, and everything else should be fine. So I'll go ahead and just close that out now that I know all my render settings are set up properly. And if we wanted, we could just preview this animation so you can see that this is a nice looping animation. So the last frame and the first frame match up perfectly, so it makes this really nice little looping animation. So let's go ahead and now see what this is going to look like whenever we go through the batch rendering process for this entire sequence. So through the render settings, we now have our start and end frames, we have our file name set, and we have our actual size set. So once we have all these things in place, we now need to go into the rendering menu. So let's pull this down, switch to rendering. That will now switch up some of the different menu commands that we have up here. So inside the rendering, let's go to render, and now batch render. So you can see now it's going to begin this batch rendering process. We can see this down here. And if we wanted to, we could actually take a look at this inside of our script editor. So we could just pop this open and actually watch the rendering progress as it starts to go through this. So it is right now 0% finished with frame 1, and it's just going to continue going through this until it reaches the end of our sequence. Alright, and once this is finished, we'll actually display that this rendering has now been completed. And now if we take a look inside of this images directory, we should be able to find these image sequences that have been rendered out. So I'm going to take a look inside my Beginner's Guide to Maya project files again, because this is where I had my project set to render out. Now again, go inside my images directory, and here's my rendered sequence. So again, we're going to have one image for every single frame that we have. So potentially you could wind up with a lot of images in here if you wind up rendering out some kind of a large or a long animated sequence. So what do we actually do with these once we render these out? Well, there's a couple of options for you. One is if we wanted to keep this as an image sequence and just simply view this, we could open this up in something like fcheck, which you should have if you installed Maya. So if we were to open these up in something like fcheck, we can see here's my first frame. And we can come in here, just go to Open Animation, and go ahead and just click on the first frame here. Alright, we'll give this just a moment to load up. And there we are. So now fcheck will go through and play through these animated sequences, so it's just going to play through one frame right after the other, just playing through this sequence of images. And now we can see our final rendered sequence. Now, what if we actually wanted to render this out as something like an AVI or a QuickTime? Well, we could now take these different images and then pull these into another application. So you could very easily pull that image sequence into something like Autodesk Composite if you have access to that, or if you have access to something like Adobe After Effects, you can also import your image sequence into these applications and then from there render out something like an AVI or a QuickTime file. Now, if you don't have access to either one of these applications, we do have something like Virtual Dub, which is a free application that you can download and use. Again, it will allow you to pull in your image sequences and then render out something like an AVI or a QuickTime if that is something that you need to do. So this now brings us to the conclusion of this beginner's guide to Maya. Now from here, if you'd like to take a more in-depth look at Maya in general, I would highly recommend viewing our Introduction to Maya course. Also, if you'd like to learn more about some of the other aspects of Maya, Digital Tutors has a number of courses that you can choose from. For example, if you'd like to learn more about modeling, you can view our Introduction to Modeling course. If you'd like to learn more about animation, you can view our Introduction to Animation course. If you'd like to learn more about lighting and rendering, you can view our Introduction to Rendering course. And these are really just a few of the hundreds of additional courses that we have available at digitaltutors.com.